Dr. Paville Haines. She's an assistant professor at the political science department at Rollins College. She has a dual bachelor's in political science and psychology with highest honors from Montana State University. She received her master's and PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University, and she specializes in identity politics, political psychology, race and ethnicity, and public opinion. She's written papers such as What Makes a True American, Latinos and National Identity, and Elite Rhetoric and Racism, Private Attitudes versus Public Expressions of Racial Hostility. We're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say today, so please, everyone, please welcome Dr. Haines.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be speaking with you. I want to share some research that I've been working on for the past 8 years. Actually, this is my dissertation research, and it's exciting to get to share it with this particular group. It is academic research, so I apologize if some of it is a little bit dense. I'm going to do my absolute best to make it accessible and to give you some ideas about what this means sort of for real-world politics, not just in a sort of theoretical or academic sense. And what I'm going to be talking about is how over the last 3 decades, Republican presidential candidates in particular have created this exclusionary patriotic narrative, was what I call it. And what this means is that when they talk, when they are giving campaign speeches, we see that they're rhetorically packaging love of country, patriotism, with racial discrimination. That those two things seem to go hand in hand for them. And so what my research shows is that as a result of this, and it's been going on for years, for many white voters, I love America, right? That statement is basically code for I hate minorities. Right. So of course, we remember the 2016 election, and in this particular election, patriotism was sort of front and center. And that's sort of where my research begins. It begins with the observation that patriotic campaign messages are almost always a really important part of presidential elections. And so throughout the campaign in 2016, Donald Trump promised to make America great again, right? Of course, that was his slogan. It was something that he actually borrowed from Reagan, who used it back in the 80s, so it was a recycled patriotic campaign slogan. And when he announced his candidacy, anyone remember that particular speech, how that went? Yeah, a few of you, right? So he said, we need to make America great again, and then he went on to talk about immigrants being rapists and saying, they're not us, they're not you. And so right there, we could see how he was packaging patriotism with racial hostility. Now, Hillary Clinton also talked about patriotism in this election, but she did something very different. Her retort was, America is already great. And if this maybe wasn't an outright celebration of diversity, at the very least, it was sort of meant to repudiate what Trump was saying about patriotism and ethnocentrism. So why do candidates do this? It's not just Trump and Clinton. Like I said, Trump borrowed his campaign slogan from Reagan. And we see that candidates in lots of elections talk about patriotism, often in sort of racially hostile ways. So why are they doing this? Well, presumably, they make patriotic appeals, which I'm defining as emotive statements that articulate reverence or love of country, because they anticipate some sort of electoral benefit, right? They think that voters are more inclined to support them if they can show that they are highly patriotic. And there is some research, including some of my own, to show that this actually works, right? That voters like hearing candidates say, I'm proud to be American, I love my country, and they're more likely to vote for them. But what I want to talk about today is not that per se, because patriotic appeals can also feed into a larger dialogue about who should count as truly American and who should not. And candidates aren't just enticing voters with these appeals. What they're really doing is they're creating a vision of what it means to be an American. And so elections are actually critical moments for us, not just in terms of who we select, but in terms of how we reckon with this idea of the meaning of American identity, and who gets included and who gets excluded from our national community. All right, so today I want to grapple with really two central questions. The first is, to what extent do presidential candidates talk about patriotism, and in doing so, implicate issues of racial or ethnic diversity? Do they use their patriotic appeals to call for a vision of America that's grounded in diversity and inclusion, or are they more likely to use their appeals to cultivate an exclusionary vision of American identity? Which of these two better describes what it is they're doing with these patriotic appeals? And then secondly, I want to explore, well, how do white voters, in particular whites, react to these appeals? Are they aware of either some sort of inclusionary or exclusionary subtext? And does that affect the way that they see their fellow citizens? Does it change how they react to racial and ethnic diversity? Okay, so I'm just going to go over, I'm not going to keep it a mystery, I'm not going to keep you in suspense. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to find, and then we'll work backwards and I'll show you the evidence that I have to support that. And so I basically have 4 findings. So the first is that when we look at campaign speeches, and I'm looking at campaign speeches from 1980 through 2016, basically if there was a campaign speech transcribed somewhere made by one of the major presidential candidates in that time frame, I read it and I looked for patriotic appeals. And what I find is that Republican presidential candidates talk about patriotism constantly. It is pervasive in their campaign speeches, but what's more important is they package it with discrimination. And so by this I mean they'll say, I love my country, and then a few sentences later they'll say something that's racially hostile or exclusionary. Democrats do something a little bit different. They're talking about patriotism too, although not as much, but the key difference really is how they're using it. They aren't packaging their patriotic appeals with racialized statements. So they're not saying, you know, I'm proud to be an American, and then making a statement about racial diversity, either positive or negative for the most part. They're pretty neutral about it. Their patriotic appeals don't have sort of any clear racial meaning behind them. And then when we think about how does this impact voters, are they aware of it? Absolutely they are. So when we look at what happens when white voters hear these appeals from Republicans, we see that after hearing them, all of a sudden they're much more hostile towards different groups of minorities, including racial minorities. It actually affects the way they view their fellow citizens. With Democrats though, right, their patriotic appeals don't have a racial subtext, and so people, right, they're kind of unaffected when it comes to racial attitudes. They don't change the way they view their fellow citizens. It doesn't affect who they think about in terms of who counts as an American versus who does not. And so really the most important takeaway from all of this, if you don't remember anything else, remember this, is that the dominant patriotic narrative in the United States is racially exclusionary. There is no sort of patriotic narrative that's grounded in the idea of racial inclusion or patriotic inclusion. And as a result, for many whites, patriotism is used as a justification for racism. In short, patriotic rhetoric in the United States has been weaponized to reinforce and exacerbate racial hostility over the past 30 years. All right. So now I know some of you might actually not be too surprised by these findings. I was talking with them a little bit a few weeks ago with my next door neighbor, who's actually here today, Heather. And she said, oh, that doesn't shock me at all. When I see someone who has an American flag on their car, I immediately think, oh, they're probably racist. And right, I don't know if other people have that reaction. Maybe a few of you.
Without question.
And
Golf carts with the flags bigger than the cart. You know?
yeah. So right, in this group, it's maybe not surprising, but actually scholars in the scholarship, the academics, this is a little bit surprising. Because for a long time, academics actually thought of patriotism as being sort of a wholesale positive thing. They didn't think that it could have sort of these negative effects. And why is this? Well, in some ways, patriotism is actually a beneficial ideology, and we can see this too, right? Because after all, if people are united by love of country, shouldn't they want to take care of one another? Shouldn't they want to help their fellow citizens out? And so we can think back to, for example, right after 9/11, everyone talks about how united we were and how patriotic and how great that was. It was very short-lived. It didn't last very long at all, right? But, you know, there are those moments. Or after a natural disaster, people will send relief to their fellow citizens who are states away. And why do they do that? Well, patriotic love of country. They feel that these are my fellow citizens, I have an obligation to them. So that's how scholars have looked at patriotism for a long time, as sort of this really beneficial sort of force that brings people together and unites them. And actually, if we think about it from that perspective, we can see why scholars might actually anticipate that patriotism could generate racial tolerance, right? So if we've got all these groups in our country, right? We've got African Americans and whites, we have people who speak English versus Spanish, we have Christians and atheists, right? We have Hispanic people, we have poor and wealthy, we have all these different groups that are sort of siloed under our national identity. Well, patriotism could help people to say, you know what, those boundaries between these different groups doesn't matter. We're all Americans. We're all in this together. And actually, we even see sometimes that candidates do talk about patriotism in this way. So for instance, right, Barack Obama, when he was giving his speech at the Democratic conference in 2004, he said there is not a black America and a white America. There's the United States of America. And then the rest of that speech went on to talk about patriotism and its value and love of country in great detail. And so he was clearly calling for a patriotism that looks something like this, right? Where the boundaries between these groups are eliminated and we all just see ourselves as Americans. So I guess the question then, when I started thinking about this all these years ago for me, was why is there such a disconnect between what scholars have to say about patriotism as being a source of tolerance and unity, and sometimes what we see candidates doing on that front, versus this idea of if there's an American flag on a golf cart, that signals racism. What is the deal there? And the answer is complicated. And in fact, actually, when we think about sort of different ways of approaching this, the notion of patriotic tolerance as well as sort of patriotic intolerance both have sort of some grounding. So I've explained a little bit about why we might think patriotism could potentially lead to tolerance. So what's the theory behind patriotic intolerance? So we'll look at that too. So scholars who are focused on patriotism, like I said, they think it's a positive thing. But then there's this separate line of research that is about American identity and who people associate with American identity. And it suggests that maybe this idea of patriotism as being unifying is not so simple. So in this line of research, scholars are not so concerned about patriotism itself. They just want to know, who do people think count as American? And in fact, what we see is that very consistently, if you ask people who's an American, they're going to say, oh, well, the stereotype is they're white, they're born in the United States, they're a Christian, and they speak English, right? That's the stereotype consistently. It's actually very exclusionary. And anyone outside of that particular reference group who doesn't have all of those attributes, well, are they really an American? I mean, they might be an American citizen, but are they part of our nation group from a social perspective? There's actually one really interesting experiment where scholars asked people to look at pictures of either Kate Winslet, who is white and British, right, and as well as a picture of Lucy Liu, who actually is American, but she's Asian American. And they asked people to rate how American they thought each of these two women were. And can you guess the results? Let's just say that the actual American was not the one who was rated as being more American. Everyone thought that Kate Winslet was the true American, when in fact it was Lucy Liu. And so that just goes to show how pervasive this idea of American, being an American as being white in particular, really is. And so this also highlights a key problem with the notion of patriotic tolerance, right? It assumes that citizenship defines membership in a nation, that just being fellow citizens is enough to unite people. What may actually be more important than this boundary between American and non-American, even though that's maybe the deciding legal factor, it may not be the deciding social factor. What may actually be more important for that is, are you a member of this reference group? So if you have all of these attributes, you're in this reference group, you're very American. If you don't, you get much closer to this border, right? You're seen as less American. You're not seen as being really a fellow citizen, even though technically you are. And there's one other influential theory that kind of supports this, which suggests that politically dominant groups, like whites in the US in this case, effectively try to claim ownership of a nation. And according to this theory, American nationality and whiteness have become complementary because whites have had the power to define themselves as the reference group and make the ideal of a true American in their own image. And this gives them immense power, right? Because if they say we're the true Americans and everyone else is on the outside, we're the ones who should be making the decisions, not anyone else. And there's a lot of research confirming this, right? And so we have these two takes on, well, patriotism could be unifying and generate tolerance, or it could do some really horrible things if it's associated with national identity, and that national identity is exclusionary. And we see candidates doing making statements that are kind of exclusionary as well. So this one is relevant for this group, I think, in particular. So in 1988, George W. Bush, for instance, said, I don't know that atheists should be considered patriots, right? And by extension, maybe not even real Americans or real citizens, perhaps, right? That's a very clear use of patriotism as a way to claim ownership of the nation for this reference group.
In God we trust.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So this kind of gives us three different models for how we might think about what is it that patriotism really does in a society. Because it could do kind of three different things, really, if we think about all these theoretical frameworks and all this research that has been done. Right? So on the one hand, it could be exclusionary. And so if it's exclusionary, what we should see happening, we should see it being used in a very particular way. We should see that candidates use patriotic appeals to emphasize differences between racial groups, to create people who are the true Americans and then everyone else who's on the outside. And we should also see that people react to this, that they sort of buy into this idea. And so when you ask them who's a true American, who's the patriot, they very clearly favor that reference group, whites, Christians, native-born people. And so for those who are in minority groups, they're on the outside. The alternative, of course, is that it's inclusionary, that it actually does lead to sort of tolerance, right? We're all in this together, let's unify, racial differences, socioeconomic differences don't matter, we're all Americans. And so if that's the case, we should see candidates talking about it as such, kind of like Barack Obama did in 2004, and people should be buying into it. That when they're reminded of their American identity and of their patriotic duty, right, all of a sudden they say, black, white, it doesn't matter, we're all Americans. Alternatively, it could be that patriotism does far less than scholars have actually thought, right? Maybe it really doesn't do much at all, it's kind of neutral, it is what it is. Candidates talk about patriotism to win some votes, but it really doesn't affect people one way or the other in terms of how they think about who counts as truly American or not. It just is sort of there. That's a third possibility. And so in my work, I try to figure out which of these models best describe what's happening in the United States. Also, the Republican Party, what's going on with them, which model do they fit? And the Democratic Party too. Which model is it that they fit? All right, so let's get into some of the results of my research. This is the good stuff, the really interesting stuff, I think. And so first I want to look at, well, how do candidates actually talk about patriotism? And so, like I said, to do this, I looked at a lot of campaign speeches. I looked about 2,500 campaign speeches, all in all, from 1980 onward. I read them all. I looked for patriotic statements in all of them. It was a pretty big undertaking. So yes, I had the utter pleasure of reading all of Trump's speeches in this process. And if you think it's difficult to understand what he's trying to say while he's talking, imagine trying to read it and you have no context clues with, pitch of voice or hand signals. I made it through, but anyway. So things that I was looking for. Basically, my key thing was, are they making patriotic references? And so that included statements like, I'm proud to be an American, or this is a great country, or I love my fellow citizens. Basically anything that indicated some sense of pride, love, or loyalty for the United States. But then I was also looking at other things. So what's the subtext behind these appeals? That's what I really want to get at. Just not just are they using them or not, but what's the subtext behind them? And so to do that, I also looked for any time they made a reference to diversity, right? And so this could be as simple as saying African Americans, Latinos, right? Those are obvious references to diversity, culture, but sometimes the references were a little bit more subtle. So for instance, a lot of scholarship shows that when candidates talk about crime, it's often a dog whistle for racial hostility. And so if they're talking about crime in a kind of racialized way, I would have picked up on that as well. And what I did then is I looked for instances where they mentioned patriotic appeals and then either right before or after they said something about diversity. So those two things were basically being coupled, right? Even if they were not explicitly linking them, they were paired side by side, and so people would go from thinking about, oh, patriotism to, oh, issues of race in the United States. So that coupling was really important. I also did one other thing, and this is a little bit more of a technical thing, but someone once asked me, well, how do you know that they are intentionally pairing racial statements with patriotic statements? Maybe they talk about patriotism so much that basically it's going to look like it's coupled with anything. It's going to look like they're talking about patriotism and then they start talking about national defense, right? And so how do you know that this is really an intentional thing? So I added another thing. I also looked for competence appeals. So these are appeals that are things like, I've had years of experience. I was Secretary of State, right? Whatever it is. And the idea here is that I wanted to see if these competence appeals were being coupled with patriotic appeals too. Because if they are, then it suggests that, yeah, maybe these pairings with patriotism and race are not as important. But if we see that the competence appeals are not being coupled with the patriotic appeals in the same way as the racial appeals or the diversity appeals, then yeah, something's going on there. We're not just sort of, picking up on something that is basically random. So that's how I did this, and so I'll get to the results here. So first of all, I just want to show you how often candidates are using patriotic appeals. It's pretty impressive. So this is basically the percentage of sentences that contain a patriotic appeal, and we go from 1980 to 2016. The red bars are the Republicans, the blue bars are the Democrats, and right away a couple of things stick out. So first of all, we see that Republicans in almost every year, with the exception of 96 maybe, are talking about patriotism a whole lot more than their Democratic counterparts. 2008, right? 12 and 16 are pretty big differences there, right? So in 2016, Clinton, for instance, included some sort of patriotic reference in about 8% of her sentences, while Trump included patriotic references in close to 14% of his sentences. So he's talking about patriotism pretty constantly, right? When you think about what are all of the things that candidates have to talk about on the campaign trail, right? Well, they have to talk policy, they have to talk sort of constituent concerns, all of these things. 14% of your sentences devoted to patriotism is a lot. That is a lot of talk about patriotism. So that's sort of the second big finding, is that it's pretty ubiquitous. The last thing that I just want to highlight, because I began by talking about 2016, is that at least in terms of patriotic rhetoric, it really wasn't that different from previous elections, right? We tend to think of 2016 as an anomaly, I think, in a lot of ways. But in actuality, what I'm seeing is that it's a continuation of this trend. It's a culmination of the trend in some ways. So if Trump was particularly aggressive about using patriotism as a way to sort of, say that immigrants, for instance, are not true Americans, that's nothing new. That's been going on for a very, very long time. So let's look at how they tie their patriotic appeals to issues of diversity, though, because that's the next thing. And that's the really important thing. Not just how much are they talking about patriotism, but what are they trying to do with it? Okay. Oh, and last little thing, I guess, if we look at the overall mean, 10.1% on average of Republican sentences contain a patriotic appeal versus about 7.7% for Democrats. So again, that just reinforces the partisan difference there. All right, so this particular chart is a little bit tricky to read, but I'm going to go through it. This is what's happening with the Democratic candidates, first of all. So when we're looking at just the Democrats, how are they using these patriotic appeals? And so what we've got here, right, on the y-axis, this is the percentage of patriotic appeals. And each bar shows the percentage of patriotic appeals that are being paired with a diversity reference, right? And in this case, I split it up between references to diversity that are kind of positive or neutral versus those that are negative and hostile. And so the higher these bars go, the more they're using patriotic appeals to say something about race, the more they're coupling those two things together. And so what we can see happening here is that overall, Democrats are pairing more of their patriotic appeals with kind of positive references to diversity, like Barack Obama did in 2004. Something happens in 2008. We see that the percentage of patriotic appeals that are meant to highlight positive issues of diversity, inclusion, go way up. Maybe that's because we have Barack Obama come onto the stage. Although Clinton carries that on in 2016, she's doing the same thing. But right, overall, what we see is that about 7.5% of Democrats' patriotic appeals are meant to be inclusive, are meant to make a statement saying we're all Americans, we're in this together, race, creed, class, those things don't matter. We should be helping one another. And about 4.1% of those are negative, where they are sort of more divisive or exclusionary. So on the whole, it sort of looks like Democrats are pretty darn exclusionary with the way that, inclusionary with the way that they're using patriotism. But now the test, right? Is this just random? Are they doing this intentionally? So we've got the placebo test, the confidence appeal. So this is the same kind of graph, but it just shows what percentage of their patriotic appeals are being coupled with a statement about their confidence. So they say something like, I'm proud to be an American, I've served my country for X number of years. I have a lot of experience, something like that. And what we can see here is that actually these two graphs look a lot alike. Okay, so when we look at this, right, we can see that actually, oh, I'm sorry, there's a little confusion here, but basically the idea here is that Democrats are talking about confidence together with patriotism almost the same rate as they are patriotism with race. So it doesn't seem like this is actually something that they're doing intentionally when they're talking about patriotism with race in a positive way. It is happenstance. So when we think about what's going on with Democrats here, which model do they fit? It's actually the neutral patriotism, right? They're kind of using patriotism in inclusionary ways, but not really, and if they are, it seems to be by chance. They're not truly inclusionary. It just sort of is what it is for them. Okay, what about Republicans? Well, it looks totally different. It's almost entirely flipped. And so what we can see here is that, right, for Republicans, when they invoke patriotism, a lot of those patriotic appeals are being followed up with some sort of negative racial reference. If we look at Trump, that's kind of just shocking, right? So 25% of the time when he'd say something patriotic, that was coupled with a racially hostile statement, right? And that shouldn't be surprising, I think, to anyone, right? It was pretty apparent and very much on display. But again, it's extreme, but it's also not unprecedented. We see this in a lot of these races, and on average, right, about 13% of Democrat or Republicans' references to patriotic appeals are racially hostile, as opposed to just about 10% that are positive or neutral. And then we've got the confidence appeals, and with the confidence appeals, we see that Republicans really aren't pairing patriotic appeals with references to confidence. So there is intentionality there. They are intentionally pairing racial hostility with patriotism in their campaign speeches. And so where do the Republican candidates fit here? Over on the exclusionary patriotic model. That's the way that they are using patriotism. And so inclusionary patriotism isn't looking so strong as a contender in the United States, right? It doesn't seem like either of the parties have really taken up the mantle of inclusionary patriotism in their campaign messaging. We've got the Republicans who are talking a whole lot more about patriotism, using it in exclusionary ways, and the Democrats who are talking about it somewhat less, sort of using it in largely neutral ways. So the next question, though, is, right, how does this affect the way that people think about who counts as an American? That's the really important one. So let's take a look at that next. So to get at this question of, well, how do people actually react to these appeals? Do they understand the racial subtext of the Republicans' patriotic appeals, and does that change the way they think about their fellow citizens? I did an experiment, and this experiment I did in 2015. It was actually before the 2016 election when all of this sort of came to a head. And what I did is I took a sample of 1,500 white Americans. So I did a survey, I recruited them, this was a random sample, and I asked them some pretty basic demographic questions to start off with. I wanted to know, their age, their marital status, their religion, their partisanship, those sorts of things. And then after that, I did the experiment. And so in the experiment, they were asked to read this short little made-up news story, basically, where they were told something about the upcoming election, and the two parties were trying to think about candidates that they could put forward who maybe were not well known yet. Again, this is before Trump came on the scene. I think I ran this, and then a few weeks later, Trump announced, and I was relieved I had run it beforehand. And so when they read this, they read one of three versions. They were randomly assigned to read a different version. So in one version, the control, they were just told, this is going to be an important election. Here are a couple of candidates that each of the parties are thinking about. The candidates were quoted on the importance of the upcoming election, and that was it. But then, in these two conditions, either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate made a patriotic appeal. No racial references in this, right? I wanted to know if the patriotic appeals themselves had that subtext without the pairing. That was the goal. And so it was the same basic setup, right, across all of these. The only thing that changed was whether or not a patriotic appeal was made and whether it came from either the Democratic or the Republican candidate. And then after that, I asked them some questions about how they felt towards different groups in American society. And I was looking to see if the people in this condition versus this condition or this condition felt differently after having read that little patriotic appeal. And then at the end, I asked them about national identity. Basically, I wanted to know how invested are they in their American identity? Because my thought was, well, there are people who are going to look at these and go, patriotism, what a crock, right? And there are people who are going to look at these and say, wow, this was really moving. I really liked what this candidate had to say. And we can probably guess who's going to be more impacted by a patriotic appeal. It's people who say, I'm really proud to be an American. That's an important part of my identity. And so I asked them about that as well. Now, I get a question a lot, which is, why am I only looking at whites? Why only white Americans? And the answer to that is because these messages, at least from the Republican side, I believe, are meant to target white voters. It's as simple as that, right? They are not trying to influence or inspire people of color. That is not their goal. They are trying to influence the thinking of whites. And so I wanted to know, are they successful at doing that? In my future research, one of the things I do want to do soon, hopefully, is understand more about how these messages affect people of color. That is a goal of mine. But I think they're going to react really differently. And so I didn't want to put this all together. I wanted to think carefully about, first off, whites, the target group. And then I think people of color require careful, separate study to really understand what's going on with them as well and how they're thinking about patriotism and reacting to patriotic rhetoric. So just whites, that's why. Yeah.
Does that include white Hispanic or white European?
So no, non-Hispanic whites. So Latinos were not included in this at all.
Okay, just thinking like Ted Cruz type.
Yep, nope, Ted Cruz would have been filtered out of this survey pretty quickly. Although he might be one of the target whites we're talking about, but he would have been filtered out. All right. So to give you a sense of what the people who took this survey experienced, here is what the little news story looked like in part. So in every news story, each candidate was quoted once. So in the control, one of the quotes looked like this: there are many challenges that must be faced, but I believe that people already know this. They must show courage and wisdom. In the patriotic conditions, that was changed to, there are many challenges that this country must face, but I believe in the greatness of our country and am proud to call myself an American. I am confident in the courage and wisdom of the American people. And again, that was either attributed to the Democrat or the Republican, depending on which condition you were in. Now again, I want to emphasize, there is nothing racial in here, right? We're just looking at the patriotic appeal on its own to see if people have sort of picked up over time the racialized meaning that is kind of hidden behind it. All right, so here are the results of that experiment. Oh, first of all, I guess I should say, how did I measure group attitudes? This is kind of important. I know it's technical, I'm sorry, but it is an important piece if you want to understand the results. So to understand how people felt towards a couple of different groups, I used what's called the Generalized Group Attitude Scale. And that is a scale that scholars have developed, and it is very intentionally set up so that you can use it to measure attitudes towards any group that you're interested in understanding. And the reason for this is there are specific measures of, for instance, attitudes towards African Americans, attitudes towards women, but because the stereotypes associated with each of those groups vary, for instance, it might not make sense to, ask people something like, do you think that low-income people are passive, right? That might be a measure you would ask about women if you want to understand people's attitudes towards women and whether they buy into that stereotype. Doesn't make sense if you want to know about people's attitudes towards low-income groups. This particular scale avoids that. It's generalized, right? So same scale for every group that I was looking at. And I looked at attitudes towards a couple of different minority groups. So immigrants, African Americans, poor Americans, and LGBT Americans. In the survey it said gay Americans. I also looked at attitudes towards a couple of majorities that I thought this could be kind of interesting too, right? How might these patriotic appeals affect attitudes towards these more dominant groups? So whites and then soldiers, right? And I picked soldiers because they're kind of considered a symbol of patriotism. So I thought that would be interesting to throw in there as well. So on this scale, just so that you understand how it works, people answer a few questions about their attitudes towards each group. It gets converted to this 100-point scale. And if the average score for a particular group is 0, the bottom of the scale, that means that attitudes towards that group are very, very cold. People do not like that group. If the average score is 100, the top end of the scale, people really like that group. They're very warm toward the group. If it's 50, right in the middle, sort of so-so. Lukewarm, don't really dislike them, don't really like them either, kind of split down the middle. All right, so here are the results from the experiment. So again, I know there is a lot going on here, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to break it down so hopefully you can see what's happening here. So first of all, these are the results from the Democratic Patriotic Appeal condition. So this is how people reacted if they heard or they read about the Democrat making that patriotic appeal that I showed you. And so each panel shows their attitudes towards different target groups, right? Toward immigrants, African Americans, the poor, gay Americans, whites, and soldiers. On the y-axis, we have the predicted score, right? So here's, if they're up here, if you see points up here, really warm, and down here, more cold. And then on the x-axis, we have it divided up between those people who say, patriotism, American identity, so what? And the people who think it's really important. So our weak national identifiers and our strong national identifiers is what that is. And we should anticipate that these are the people who are more likely to be impacted by getting this appeal. And then it's broken up, you'll see, by the control, the gray dots, and the treatment, the black dots. So again, I know there's a lot of moving pieces here, but let me show you what this means. So first of all, when we look at immigrants, let's look at the control first, so the gray dots. We can see that on the whole, they're not particularly well received. They're at about a 55, so pretty lukewarm. That's where both of those dots are. And there doesn't really seem to be much of a difference between the weak and strong national identifiers. They feel similarly about immigrants. If they get the Democratic Patriotic Appeal right here, it doesn't change things much, right? So if we compare this dot to this dot, the Democratic Patriotic Appeal makes them like 1.82 points warmer towards immigrants, which on a 100-point scale is nothing, right? So nothing is happening here. The Democratic Patriotic Appeal didn't change the way that whites felt about immigrants. If we look at their attitudes toward African Americans, kind of the same thing. The black and the gray dots are basically the same. It didn't change how they felt about African Americans. Same with poor Americans. The black and gray dots are basically in the same place. Same with LGBT Americans, same place. Whites, interesting thing here, we can see that there's a big difference between how weak national identifiers and strong national identifiers feel about whites. People who are gung-ho about American identity like whites a lot more than people who are not so gung-ho. But again, the gray and black dots are in the same places. So getting that Democratic Patriotic Appeal just didn't change things much for them. And kind of the same with soldiers. Soldiers are the best liked group, right? We can see that for strong national identifiers in particular, they're almost at 100. They're almost maxed out on warmth. But again, the gray and black dots are in the same places. So The Democratic Patriotic appeal didn't change the way that people felt really about any of these groups, right? Which makes sense, right? We know that the Democrats are not really intentionally coupling their patriotic appeals with racial references, either positive or negative. And so if people are aware of that, when they hear a Democrat make a patriotic appeal, they take it for what it is and they move on. It doesn't conjure up considerations about who belongs in this country and who doesn't, or how that's related to race or socioeconomic status. So this actually makes sense, right? People are responding in the way we would anticipate given how Democrats use patriotic rhetoric. God. Here we go with Republicans. It looks shockingly different. So what's going on here? Well, we can see over here that for immigrants, if you are a strong national identifier, if you place a lot of stock in your American identity, and you get this appeal, all of a sudden you're about 15 points more hostile towards immigrants. You're much less tolerant of them, just by hearing this little appeal. Again, there's nothing racial in the appeal. But people have picked up on when a Republican says, I love this country, that's what it means. I love this country, and I don't like minorities. That's the sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken part, and people just naturally fill it in. What about attitudes towards African Americans? Same thing, about an 11-point drop, right? They become more hostile by about 11 points. About a 7-point drop towards low income, 4-point drop towards white or LGBT. And then something really interesting happens. We get to these dominant groups, and all of a sudden, we have the reverse. They actually like whites better, right? After getting this appeal from the Republican, they're 10 points more warm towards whites and 8 points more warm towards soldiers. So the Republican, when they make that same patriotic appeal, just changing which party it comes from, people respond totally differently. And they have heard that Republican pairing of patriotism with racial hostility so many times that you don't even need the racially hostile statement there. They just intuit, they fill it in, and they say, oh yeah, being an American means being white, being Christian, being wealthy. And so these groups, I don't really like them because they're not true Americans. They don't fit in to this conception of American identity. They don't fit into the dominant reference group. So to make this just a little more, this Republican patriotic appeal, a little more straightforward, because again, I know there's a lot happening in this graph. Here's another way to look at it, okay? So these are just the racial groups in the study, right? How do they feel towards whites, African Americans, and immigrants? So racial and ethnic, because we're assuming probably immigrants are mostly Hispanic. So this is the control. So in the control, right, the average rating for whites was 74.8, pretty warm. It was 60.9 for African Americans, so a little cooler. And it was 54.3 for immigrants, so kind of ambivalent, lukewarm. So again, this is the control. What happens when they get the Republican patriotic appeal? How do these averages change? Well, it looks something like, oh, first of all, I'll just show you the difference before we get to that. So in the control, right, there's a 14-point difference between how they feel about whites and African Americans, and about a 21-point difference in how they feel about whites versus immigrants, right? Those are pretty big differences already from the get-go. They feel much more warmly towards whites. So what happens when they get the Republican patriotic appeal? Well, it looks like this. So the attitude towards whites gets warmer. It goes up to about 84.4. It goes up by that 10 points that I was telling you about. Attitudes towards African Americans gets cooler. It drops to 50.3. And attitudes towards immigrants also gets cooler. It drops to 39. So that's pretty chilly. They don't really like immigrants at this point. And so if we think about the difference now, right? It's gone to a 34-point difference between whites and African Americans, and a 45.4-point difference between whites and immigrants. So in other words, what we see is when you get this Republican patriotic appeal, favoritism for whites goes up dramatically, right? You like whites much better. You like people of color and immigrants much, much less, right? And so it's a pretty dramatic impact on how people see these different groups. So if we go back to these different models, again, where do things fit? Well, it looks like this, right? We see that patriotic appeals, when they're coming from Republican, are increasing anti-minority sentiment among white Americans, particularly those who have a strong sense of American identity. And it's a really dramatic effect. They are absolutely picking up on the racial subtext, the exclusionary subtext behind Republicans' patriotic appeals. With Democrats, right, no impact. It doesn't change how people are thinking about these different groups. The identical quote just coming from a Democrat has no impact. So it's neutral. It doesn't have a racialized context. And we just don't have any evidence whatsoever for inclusionary patriotism. That's not how candidates are talking about patriotism. That's not how voters, white voters, are reacting to patriotic ideals. Which is, I think, alarming, right? That the inclusionary patriotism hypothesis in the United States simply has so little evidence to support it. That inclusionary patriotism really is not a piece of our dialogue, it's not a piece of our political culture in this country. Okay, so again, I want to just reiterate the key takeaway to kind of wrap things up before I open up for questions, is that by fusing love of country with hostility towards racial minorities and minority groups, the Republican Party has established a pretty powerful electoral narrative that appeals to large blocks of white voters by animating their desire for exclusive racial ownership over American identity. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has largely abdicated any responsibility whatsoever for crafting a patriotic narrative that's consistent with inclusionary racial ideals. And this is unlikely to change anytime soon, in my mind, in part because in other research I show that Republican candidates enjoy an enormous electoral benefit from doing this, right? It helps them win over white voters. And so these white voters also receive a benefit. They like it too. And why do they like it? Well, because they receive sort of a psychological boost from having their racial anxieties and hostilities justified as love of country. If you can say, I'm not racist, I'm just a patriotic American, right? That's a pretty easy way to get out of any questioning. So it's a mutually beneficial arrangement for these Republican candidates and these racially hostile white voters. They both benefit from it, and so it's unlikely that this is going to stop anytime soon. So given this, I think it's really important to acknowledge that at least in its current form, American patriotism is largely incompatible with the ideals of multicultural, inclusionary democracy. And some of the other research that I've also talked about and have done myself also underscores the harms caused by exclusionary patriotic appeals, right? It's really grave harm and it's largely unsustainable. It will tear apart our country. We know that polarization is on the rise. This is a component of that, right? This is in part what is driving that. So, are there any upsides here? Is it going to give you any positive news today? Maybe actually. So one thing that I also have looked at is how patriotic attitudes differ across generations. And one of the things that I do find is that there are generational declines in patriotism. Younger people are much more likely to reject the ideal of patriotism. And so if you put these types of appeals in front of them, the Republican patriotic appeals, they're going to reject them pretty quickly. And it's not even so much that they may or may not be racially hostile, right? That's a separate question. But they just dislike the idea of patriotism as a whole. And so if younger folks are turning their back on patriotism as an ideology, what this means is that, not in the short term, but at least in the long run, it's possible that these racially hostile patriotic appeals being made by Republican candidates will cease to be electorally beneficial. And at a certain point, they're going to give up on them because, they're not useful. They don't help them win over voters. So this may be a good thing, right? We could think of this as, well, there is a way forward. Eventually, we're going to get out of this. And I think there's something true to that. I also do think, though, and this is where I would challenge the people in this group, right? This is where I think, well, if you want to know what you can do, this is it. I think that it is troubling that we are seeing that the options in our country are currently embrace exclusionary patriotism or throw patriotism out wholesale. Because as I said, patriotism actually has a lot of potential benefits. It is not an inherently harmful ideology. It has been weaponized in this country. Patriotism is what we make it. And so I think, right, when you think about patriotism, really in a lot of ways, it's pretty critical to the functioning of a country, right? It binds people together, it gets people to sacrifice on behalf of their fellow citizens. All of those are good things. And so I think if the Democratic Party and Democratic Party voters could step up and say, I am patriotic, I am a faithful American, and that means I'm tolerant and racially inclusive, right? I think that could be a game changer. And so hopefully, if we can do that, perhaps rather than tapping into our basest impulses, patriotism can be used to help us achieve our highest ideals instead. So that is all I have for you, but I'm happy to take questions at this time.
Yes, as the second foremost expert on this. No, I'm just kidding. This is my wife, by the way.
Of course, my husband is the one who wants to question.
I know, exactly. So one of the things that I, thought could be interesting for everyone to understand is the fact that, did you see a significant difference in the respondents' partisanship? So did the respondents' partisanship, so whether the respondent to the survey was a Democrat or Republican, did that have an impact on the way that the appeal affected them?
It did not, actually, which is really shocking. So if you have, now, it is true that when you ask people how important is being an American to you, we see that Republicans are more likely to say it's really important, Democrats are less likely. But if you had a Democrat who said, being an American is really important to me, I really consider myself patriotic, they were just as likely to buy into that racially hostile Republican appeal. So it is shockingly kind of persuasive in a way that transcends party lines, which means that if you're a Democrat who wants to be patriotic, you have to be careful about not letting yourself get caught up in that narrative.
Yeah, so the dog whistle isn't partisan.
The dog whistle is not partisan in this case.
Okay, so I agree with your statement that patriotism can be a beneficial thing if addressed in a fair way. Do you think, even though the younger generation is not as patriotic, that as they get older, they may get more conservative and have a negative sort of patriotism like people in the Republican Party do now?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. The scholarship on do people get more conservative, for instance, as they get older, actually suggests that they really don't, which is shocking because everyone assumes that, oh, as you get older, you get more conservative. And that's not quite what we see. What we see is that different generations come into the political arena at different times, and that sort of determines which way they're going to go, and then they're kind of locked in. And there's very little change over the course of the lifetime. So I don't know if younger voters will become more conservative. Will they become more patriotic? I don't know. I mean, I think there isn't a good way to predict that. I kind of hope they do, but in this positive way.
In a positive way, yeah.
Yeah.
I have seen the belief among conservatives, people I know, and things they send out in their email, that Well, if you're young, sure, you're going to be a liberal, but when you get older, you're going to know better.
No, the Republican Party is in trouble because we don't have any evidence that that happens. The young
What?
people today are going to have probably many of the same ideals that they do now 15, 20 years from
Oh,
now.
good.
Professor, this is not a question, but more just an observation. I suspect that if those questions were asked of politicians from 1930 to 1960, you'll have the same kind of result, except that the Democrats would be the ones that were regressive, if you will, and the Republicans more progressive. That is why I don't refer to the two political parties as Republican or Democrat. I refer to them as regressives or progressives because parties do flip over time.
That is absolutely true. So we know that parties change over time in pretty dramatic ways, and so you're absolutely right. The Republican Party today is not the same party that it was in 1900 or even 1930, and that's the same for the Democratic Party. They're the same party in name only. But yeah, you're exactly right.
Hi, thank you. In your graph that showed the military representation, do you feel that that was atypical in the other groups because the military is more homogenized?
The military is interesting, and I still kind of am trying to parse out what it means because on the one hand, you know, the military, I think, is associated with patriotism so heavily in the United States, right? We are eager to thank veterans for their service. We, you know, talk about, you know, military service is a great patriotic sacrifice. The flip side is the military actually includes a lot of people of color, right? Many of the people who enlist are people of color, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So there's something fascinating there where, on the one hand, soldiers are seen as sort of patriotic icons, but many of them are people of color. So I don't know that it was sort of anomalous, but I think there is something interesting happening there with the intersection of race versus this sort of symbolic role that soldiers play in our society.
In what way?
In what way? Well, I think it's almost as though when you ask people about soldiers, they forget about the racial aspects entirely. That's pushed off to the side, which is kind of interesting, right? That the stereotype of a soldier is ostensibly white, even though the reality is that that's not true.
So it sounds like that's probably the case due to the errors that and Dan's reference about age,
Yeah.
the perception of what people are in the military, the perception of the average person. It's based on your experience, your baggage, your history, and the history is changing quickly in that way. And there's more gay people in the military openly, and there's more women in the military openly. And that's still not the typical stereotype. It's this white middle-class guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, the soldier's considered a soldier from World War II. That's why this.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think conservatives believe that the rank and file military is on their side. My perception is there's all too many who are, but the people in charge, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, etc., are more liberal.
I have an observation and then a question, if you don't mind. So my observation is that this thing about military, since 1980, the only time the person with more military experience that has won is George H.W. Bush against Mike Dukakis. In every other race, the person with the more military experience actually lost in the race, in every one of those.
Yeah.
Clinton, Trump was an anomaly in that neither one of them had any experience. But then the question is, how do these attitudes, have you studied if these attitudes look at how people react to environmental concerns, climate change?
Yeah. No, so I think you're right about, I think Carrie and Swiftboat is the one that comes to mind, right? The intersection of the military with patriotism is fascinating and kind of complex. In terms of your question about how does this relate to environmentalism, I haven't looked at it. It's something that I'm kind of interested in. It doesn't seem like candidates at this point, or political leaders in general, are talking about environmental patriotism, right? They're not framing, the need to adopt more environmental friendly policies as a patriotic duty. But I wonder if that's going to be changing in the future. I'm kind of watching the Democrats actually to see what they might be doing with that. I don't know, but
Republicans in South Florida, right?
oh, that's
We should
true.
talk to them.
Yeah, that's true because South Florida's in trouble. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Haines.
Freedom from religion.